Last time we were looking at systems in general and what they look like. Today we're going to talk about organizational change, but first we need to understand how a system works, especially how a school system works. That means we're going to touch on some historical and theoretical underpinnings of systems. First, I want to touch on the concept of bureaucracy. When Erchul and Martens wrote about classical organizational theory, they presented the concept of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is one way an organization could be arranged. This arrangement is a top-down process. However, consultation is more of a bottom-up approach. That is something to think about when you are going to be doing organizational or systems consultation, which is one way to create change within an organization. Another thing to be aware of is organizational climate. Organizational climate refers to the informal social environment of an organization. That social environment is a reflection of the values of the people within the organization, and it influences how the members interact with one another as well as their behavior. If we were considering a school, organizational climate would correspond to the principal's leadership style and the group norms of teaching staff. Organizational behavior theory looks at how groups are formed within an organization. The three ways to describe the groupings are listed on this slide. Schools typically follow the pooled or loose coupling. In this type of coupling, members share resources but mostly work independently. We know that a school may be its own system, but there are other forces that dictate how that system operates. Schools have mandates from the state and federal level. Listed on this slide are some of the federal mandates concerning education. In 1975, Public Law 94-142 was put forth by the 94th Congress as their 142nd piece of legislation. It involves the mainstreaming movement of LRE, or least restricted environment. A special education placement was to be as close to a normal environment as possible, not completely separate school or classroom. FYI, Public Law 94-142 is also known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. In 1986, Public Law 94-142 was amended by Public Law 99-457, which mandated free and appropriate education for preschool children from ages 3 to 5 with disabilities. An individualized family service plan was required for each child served. In 1990, Public Law 94-142 was amended again by Public Law 101-476, also known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. In 1997, IDEA was reauthorized and amended by Public Law 105-17. One of the bigger trends in the 1990s was the idea of inclusion. There have been some misconceptions about inclusion, so I'm going to briefly cover it. Inclusion is not synonymous with LRE. Mainstreaming is also different. Mainstreaming placed students with disabilities in general education settings only when they could meet traditional academic expectations with minor adaptations. Inclusive schools integrate students with special needs into their home schools with grade peers whether or not they can meet traditional standards. Special services are then brought to the students instead of having students pulled out. No Child Left Behind, also known as NCLB, was a piece of legislation that detailed the requirements listed on this slide. Most notably is the stance on high-stakes testing with the inclusion of all students. Organizational culture is the values, assumptions, and beliefs held in common by organization members that shape how they perceive, think, and act. Culture can be defined as a pattern of basic assumptions invented, discovered, or developed by a given group as it learns to cope with its problems of external adaptation and internal integration that has worked well enough to be considered valid, and therefore is taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. Manifestation of the organization's culture include climate, group norms, roles, systems, politics, and values. When you are working within an organization, you need to be aware of the culture, especially when you hope to make changes. A culture has a very strong impact on whether or not a given plan of action will be successful. Also, be aware that different segments of an organization may define themselves in terms of culture differently than does the entire organization. If you want to enact change in an organization, then you must be aware of the conditions that are needed. There are 3 conditions that are necessary for true change, and they are listed on this slide. These are some different approaches to change. Empirical rational approach assumes that people are rational by nature and will follow their rational self-interests once these are made known. Thus, any proposed changes are presumed to be congruent with the self-interests of the organization and its members. Changes will be adopted only if they can be rationally justified and gains are evident. The next approach does not deny the role of rationality in change. However, the normative re-educative approach indicates change is supported by sociocultural norms based on attitudes and values. Change involves a shift in those attitudes and values away from old patterns and a commitment to new patterns. Shifts in emotion about something will bring about change. The power coercive approach is basically what it sounds like. It focuses on the ingredients of power and the ways it is used in bringing about change. This approach relies on the use of political, economic, and moral sanctions in the exercise of power. It assumes that externally based sanctions are necessary for change to occur. In a top-down approach, change is implemented on authority of the organization's leadership, which also defines the problem and determines the solution. The bottom-up approach is the opposite of the top-down approach. Responsibility for change is delegated to members lower in the organization. Thus, administrators are typically not involved and know little about the changes. The shared approach involves a continuous interaction among members of the organization's different levels. This results in a mutual influence on change. This slide pertains to the assigned reading. I want to touch briefly on it. According to the social system's perspective, it is people within the system who give a school its life. No 2 schools are functionally alike because of the uniqueness of the individuals who inhabit and affect each of the schools. Efforts typically focus on individual schools versus districts for this reason. The reciprocal influence says that each of the parts of a system influences all of the other parts, as well as the performance of the system as a whole. In a nutshell, you need to work with the people of a system. First, you need to understand the people and how the system works. Second, working with a group of people, or a part of the system, may have a positive domino effect on the other parts of the system. Some other concepts from the reading I wanted to highlight are listed on this slide. Systems-level change is an ongoing process that should never end. Solving a specific precipitating problem should be considered only a short-term goal. You should ask yourself, who are the gatekeepers? How do you gain their support? The reading provided a model for approaching systems-level issues, which I have included here. I think this is a solid model for addressing problems at a systems level. When I think about systems or organizational change, this is what I think of, so I thought I would share it with the class. This is essentially a model for conducting organizational or systems consultation. That is it for organizational change. Please be sure to check D2L and the syllabus for upcoming assignments and their due dates.